Alright, hello and welcome to the second episode of Hot Takes. You can't rush perfection, as they say. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to everyone that listened to the first episode, left a comment, liked, subscribed. It means a lot. I think it's nearly hit 600 views, which is quite surprising considering we came from zero. So I'd like to carry on that momentum if possible. But yeah, thank you to everyone who's listened. And secondly, I'd like to say sorry to my mum. There's going to be some revelations throughout this hour and a half of podcast, but I'm being honest and you won't get that from many people my age. This week I'm going to be tackling something which I wouldn't say is at the top of the political agenda, but it's something which means a lot to me, and the hot take will be drug decriminalisation would make the UK a better place. I'll be mostly talking about decriminalisation, but I will be kind of lapsing into legalisation as well. And there is a difference between those, which I will cover as we go through the podcast. And I also will be speaking about drugs holistically, so, to make it easier. Because if I was to go through all the list of drugs, I'd be here for an eternity. And honestly, this podcast will be going on for a while, so I won't bore you with every drug and the benefits, negatives, etc. So the three ones I'm going to be focusing on are cannabis, MDMA, and hallucinogens. Firstly, I'll be covering cannabis. Secondly, I'll be covering psychedelics, hallucinogens, and then I'll be going into MDMA. But there will be special mention for the pharmaceutical companies, which I must be honest, I have a strong disdain for. But I will try and be as balanced as possible throughout the podcast and give you the benefits, the positives. And I'll be looking at the social side of it, and I'll be focusing a lot on mental health, as this means a lot to me. The justice system, so it ties a little bit into Black Lives Matter from last week, which if you haven't listened to that first episode, try and listen to it and get past the awful sound quality. And lastly, I'll be looking at the economy. So I'm not an Amazonian shaman, biochemist. I'm simply just a teenager with a fair share of positive and negative experiences with drugs. And I feel that we're lacking an open and honest discussion about the usage of drugs in society. And I think it's a well-known fact that the UK is one of the worst, I guess you could say, when it comes to the consumption of drugs. I just want to open and honest debate based on my subjective experiences and objective ones, without glorifying drugs too much. So firstly, I'm going to be looking at mental health and suicide. So at a time when we are uncertain about our futures amongst the global pandemic, mental health services have also been in long-term decline. Are we sleepwalking into an imminent mental health disaster? The UK is not alone in the rise of mental health problems, and a majority of us can relate to the feeling of anxiety, stress and depression. I know I definitely can. However, are we using the best measures available to us to tackle this growing problem? In the UK, it's suspected that 70 to 75% of people don't receive treatment, and in recent OECD studies, and for those who aren't aware, the OECD is an organisation of economic cooperation and development. I've butchered that a little bit, but that is essentially, you could say, the 30 most developed countries in terms of economic indicators in the world. And when it came to life satisfaction, the UK ranked 29th out of 30 for 15-year-olds. And it is worth mentioning that 75% of mental health problems start at the age of 15, and by the age of 18 they manifest into what we see in most people in my age group who suffer depression, anxiety, and some people even get diagnosed as treatment non-responsive, which is very depressing and sad in general. So firstly, is cannabis part of the answer, or is it part of the larger problem we see in society? So for me, I think out of all of the drugs I'm going to speak about, I had the most extensive experience with cannabis. I reckon I started smoking more recreationally every now and then, because I definitely didn't have the money to be smoking at around 15 or 16, so around year 11, maybe 10 mark, at the end of year 10. And it was really an irregular experience. Didn't really happen all the time, but as I got older, got a part-time job, you socialise with people that do it on a regular basis, and definitely some older people that you kind of buy off, kind of incentivise you into it a lot more. I guess it kind of turned into a habitual thing, and you could say an addiction. And for a long time, I didn't really see an issue with it. I say going from year 11 into year 13, I was always achieving well at school. I never dropped below a B grade, but I probably could have fulfilled my potential to a greater degree if I wasn't smoking. And I don't think I started to really notice the problems associated with it until first year university. Before then, it was just kind of, I was single, I only had myself to worry about, and life was still going well for in all kind of aspects. I had a good friendship group, we had fun together, and it never really hampered me in what I wanted to do. And if anything, I did not definitely see it as a problem for me. So I'd say after year 13 and I started university, and I was quite fortunate. I study in London, so I'm very close to home and I live at home actually. So I kind of had that support network. But around this time, sadly, one of my friends passed away through suicide. And I feel as if at that time I felt I took it as well as you can take something like that. And this person was a great friend of mine, and her memory lives on with me in pretty much everything that I do. She was someone who kind of showed me a lot of morals and values which I saw in myself, but at times was too afraid to exhibit. And she really taught me as a person how to grow and support the people in life that aren't always supported, but they should be, and they should be helped. And she done it for me on many occasions. And it took me really a long time to kind of notice that I hadn't dealt with this grief, and part of not dealing with this was just smoking. And that's when I feel it really turned into an addiction for me. I was performing awfully at university for year one. I had a girlfriend who was extremely supportive of me as a person, and I think she saw the errors in my ways before I did, much before I did, and always was trying to kind of push me in the right direction of cutting down, focusing more at university, making sure I actually attend university. And I think then about a year later, 8 months later, another close friend of mine passed away. And this is all kind of within the space of year one university, going into year two. And honestly, everything around me was crumbling, you could say. Like, I was not attending university, my relationship was breaking down despite this person having the best interests of me at heart, and me not seeing it and ignoring these kind of signs of people showing affection for me and my mental well-being. I ended up having to take a kind of a break off work for about 4 weeks, and I was really in a dark place. There's no two ways about it, and I'm not going to blame cannabis for that. But what I am going to blame cannabis for is this kind of downward cycle that I kind of saw myself fall into, and I just couldn't drag myself out of it. And my way of dealing with it was pushing away the people that really cared about me. The main person at this point being my girlfriend, who did care about me and my well-being, and then going out with people who are 100% my friends and 100% cared about me, but they didn't see the error in my ways. And if they did, they didn't always mention it to me. And to a large degree, I also hid my worries from them. And it kind of got to a critical stage for me when I was at university and I got called into a meeting. And really the meeting was, if you don't attend your classes, you're not fulfilling the contract and you won't be part of the university anymore. And that's kind of what it come down to. And by the summer of last year, just gone, life really hit the rock bottom. I lost my girlfriend through definitely not cannabis. And I think a key thing people have to realise is you can't blame the drugs. And for me, that was a really important part of kind of learning and growing, was these are my problems and I've failed to deal with them adequately, and these are the consequences that I had to deal with. I failed my maths. I had to redo maths at university, which, for those who know me, I hate maths so much. Lost my girlfriend, as mentioned. I lost connections with some friends. A lot was happening at one time, and the one thing which was there, the one constant amongst all this, was my addiction to cannabis. And it really took me a long time to actually understand that this was part of the problem. This was a really big part of the problem, along with my mindset, my failure to realise those who were around me to support me. It kept me in this state of ignorance, really, is what it comes down to. And I didn't want to help myself. I didn't really want to achieve my goals anymore. I was stuck in an absolute rut. And really, I do blame weed for kind of continuing that. But overall, as I said, you can't blame the drug. In the end, it was my mindset which was to blame, but it definitely wasn't helped by my use of cannabis, and it kind of kept me in a state of flux where I wasn't doing anything positive in my life, and everything became a negative and a drag. So I've painted a pretty dark picture of drugs, and I've probably made myself sound like I was a chronic addict. I definitely wasn't the worst addict, but it was definitely a main part of my life which would occur on a regular basis, and I'm talking at least once a day, really. So there was definitely a problem there, but I'm not going to say that all the issues that I had were, it's the drugs' fault, the drugs are evil. These were my problems, and that was all part of me growing up as a person. I just failed to deal with them in the right way, despite being told numerous times, this is the way you need to deal with it. You need to actually tackle these problems head on. And I just didn't want to do that, and I just found solace in smoking, going out with my friends, doing whatever else, anything but facing the demons that I had. And for me, this is the dangers of recreational use. It can start off as something you do at the weekend with your friends or so on, and then slowly you kind of it becomes a habit, and then And then you kind of come at a point in life, and especially in your teenage years, you come to a point in life where you have some real problems, be it with a relationship with a girlfriend or education or family. There's so many different kind of problems which can be thrown at you. And then this is when cannabis or any drug can really take hold of you and act as something which detracts you from the situation, and then you don't deal with it. And that's when it becomes a real problem, and that's when it becomes an evil addiction. But as I said, I'm not going to blame cannabis for my problems, and I own all my mistakes and take full responsibility for them. I'm not going to say that it's the drug's fault. However, there is truth in the damage that drug abuse can do to you, your decision making, and it can ultimately lead to dramatic consequences. However, through this adversity, I became a better person, and there's no doubt I was a bad person both before, and I'd characterise my behaviour as selfish, rude, discriminatory. But what cannabis did do was amplify these negative traits that I had. But at the same time, through this adversity, I feel like I've grown a lot as a person and learned a lot about myself and the people around me. And I have a lot of gratitude for the people that are in my life and the people that were previously in my life through, you could ultimately say, my addiction to cannabis, which is kind of inverse to everything I've been saying. Anyway, enough of my my very long sob story about how bad my life was. I'm not trying to make anyone feel sorry for me. Far from it. I have a very happy life, and I have a very good connection of friends and family that look after me and care for me. And by far, I'm not the worst person to have suffered an addiction, and I think I got out of mine at a good point in my life where I can now kind of balance things. I can't say the same for other people, and for my friends out there that are listening who know they have a problem with how much they smoke or any other addiction, you know my perspective on it, and you always have me to speak to. And also, it's not to say that I don't indulge every now and then. I definitely do, but I do try and refrain and use other techniques such as meditation or reading to kind of focus my mind and balance my life. I'm not a monk yet, but I'm working towards it. One day, hopefully I'll be in the hills of Thailand, relaxing, not worrying about the material things of life, and attaining that higher wisdom. But also, I'd like to make it clear that some of my friends honestly operate at a ridiculous level whilst being, you could say, drug addicts. And one of my friends is studying at university, and he's really into music, very talented in music, and he has really good connections in the music world. And someone he knows is signed to a label, earns a lot of money a year through this label. He's a professional stoner. There's no way to cut it, really. The guy smokes weed all the time, every day, and gets paid for it through the creativity it brings him. And honestly, I have some amazing experiences when I've been high with my friends. I mean, going out stargazing with my friends. The memories are countless. One of them that you could characterize as bad or you could characterize as good was when I was in Zante, my first lads holiday with all the boys. One of my friends was wearing a weed bandana on his head, and he's going up the strip in Zante, and we find some cannabis or weed, and he's rolling it on the beach early in the morning with some of the more intelligent members of the group. And when I say intelligent, I mean you're talking some of the top 5 unis in the world for their studies. And my friend gets caught rolling on the beach, and he gets arrested by the Greek police, which I must mention aren't the nicest police in the world, and I definitely wouldn't get on the wrong side of them. And I'm in my room at this point, pretty much dying of heat stroke because I just laid in the sun all day. And I see my friend cuffed with 3 burly Greek blokes come into the room. He has his weed bandana on his head, and they search the room, clear it out, looking for any more drugs. He gets sent to the main police station, and quite luckily through my friendship with the security guard, he was able to make a couple phone calls and get my friend released on a day. So I see this as a good memory to have, and it was kind of provoked through the cannabis, but I don't know, some of the older members may not find that as funny, but for me and my friends, it's a great experience to look back on, and there's many others that I could honestly go on about, but that's just one of them. For clarity, I think some people believe that cannabis consumption can cause some sort of like psychosis, and there hasn't really been many occasions where I've actually ever seen people react adversely to it, but I can refer to one time I was in West London, that kind of region, and I was seeing a couple friends, one of them from school, and there's about 5 of us out. We're just having like a little smoke before we go out and drink, just the casual mixing of substances, which I don't advise to anyone who's young listening. But one of my friends, she's been saying, "Oh yeah, I've kind of got used to smoking at university, blah blah blah, but I haven't really smoked too recently." So we gave her a little bit, and I quite literally mean a little bit. I mean like 1 or 2 puffs, and this is outside in the dark. We step inside after, and the light hits her. She goes pale and quite literally faints like onto a chair, and she's pretty much passed out. And the last words were murmured were, "I'm so good," and it literally was murmured. And as she said these words, she's quite literally just sunk into the chair as if she was just void of any kind of existence and just gone pale. And I must say, for all of us, it was kind of quite worrying, but the majority of us there were like quite experienced and knew like this wasn't kind of anything too bad. And within about a minute or two, she was back to life. But definitely street cannabis, because you can never kind of tell what's in it, doesn't always affect people the same way. And it's also one of the dangers in general of having it off the street and not kind of being sure on how pure it is, kind of the composition, whether it's high in CBD or THC. So like, there's a lot of factors which must go into it, and not everyone reacts the same, and it's not going to react with everyone's body in the exact same way. And for some people, it is going to have some negative effects, which kind of could put them off, or, you know, send them into a bit of anxiety, which is not something you want to see. All right, anyway, enough of my anecdotes and my stories, which I think are fairly balanced in their positives and negatives. I think we should look at the kind of the facts and figures around cannabis as a drug, both recreationally and, for me, I believe medicinally, how it can be beneficial. So the use of cannabis as a medicine, in records that we're aware of, dates back to approximately 2000 BC, and I'd probably say it goes back a little bit further, but in terms of documented, it's documented as the Shang dynasty of China were the first to use it, and they used it in the treatment of over 100 ailments, and it was usually alongside alcohol or any kind of other remedies they could create themselves, and it was dubbed the supreme elixir of immortality. So if you want to be immortal, I personally don't, but I'm sure some of you do, and want to preserve your ego, smoke yourself there. That's kind of my answer to it. In all seriousness, research has shown that many mental health conditions can be attributed to dysregulation of the endocannabinoid system. I'm not going to act like that's something I completely understand, but it's an important part of your body system. And this is a system which cannabis interacts with to a high level when it's ingested. But before all the stoners listening jump to the conclusion that the cure to mental health has been right under us the whole time, it is important to note there are a lot of factors which go into mental health conditions, and it is an exceptionally complex kind of area to study. And when speaking to one of my friends who is quite literally a biochemist, he did make me aware to kind of mention this kind of key areas such as like environmental factors, traumatic experiences, genetic predispositions, which can also cause chemical imbalances, and it's far from not limited to those kind of areas. So to those who listened and kind of believe that, okay, cannabis could be the answer, it may be part of the answer, but there are a lot of things which must be taken into consideration, and just getting yourself high all the time definitely isn't going to solve any of your problems. So out of the 3 areas that I've looked into in terms of the drug sections I'm going to be speaking about, there is definitely the greatest number of research when it came to cannabis. So one of the first studies I looked at was an NHS study, and it was, I believe, quite recently, and it found that 7% of depression cases may be attributed to cannabis use at adolescence, and cannabis users may be predisposed to suicidal thoughts 50% higher compared to non-users, and 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. But conversely, no risk of anxiety compared to someone who's not smoked. So I feel this is something I can personally relate to, if referencing kind of like my anecdotes, is that I definitely kind of had some negative thoughts, you could say, which were attached to my adolescent use of cannabis. But also it is key to note in this study that the research was correlational rather than causational. So it was more the fact that they looked at a few cases and saw there were similar aspects, but they also failed to take into consideration socioeconomic factors, home life, the number of uses. So some of these people who may have been suffering from depression may have only used cannabis once, and I think for all of us it's kind of fair to say, so is it really fair to say that one use of cannabis is going to make you 4 times more likely to attempt suicide? And I think most of us in a reasonable mind would probably say no. But what I do think it does is show us the recreational risks of cannabis, and it's something which I think should be taken more seriously by people and not just a casual recreational drugs, because as this study has shown, there definitely are some areas which should be looked at a higher level. It's also worth noting that the World Health Organization have declared CBD, which is a constituent part of cannabis, as safe to use, which for me is slightly paradoxical because with any kind of plant or any kind of drug in general, or even kind of a food, if you think about it in that kind of chemical sense, is best when it is used as a whole. And the way that it's kind of described in science is kind of the entourage effect. So in cannabis, you have multiple cannabinoids. The most well-known ones are CBD and THC, but I believe there's about 52 which all have a role on the endocannabinoid system. And this is kind of my conspiracy tinfoil hat on. Are these type of classifications by kind of a World Health Organization, is this in the favour of pharmaceutical firms? Because a pharmaceutical firm can't isolate a whole kind of plant and then take patent order off that and say, well, now we're going to charge whatever kind of price we deem. But if you take CBD out and isolate that as a singular component, then you can start charging a price which is higher than what you'd usually get. So I think it's questionable why only CBD has been isolated and said to have a positive effect. It definitely does have a positive effect, and there's research to show that, but it sounds like there's something going on to me, and that's definitely my conspiracy hat on. Now looking at some of the more positive evidence given on cannabis, there was a study by the University of New Mexico which shows that smoking cannabis can provide immediate relief from symptoms of depression, and higher levels of THC shows greater immediate effect and relief from symptoms of depression. I think it's clear to state that this obviously isn't the recreational use that many of us have kind of indulged in and experienced. This is kind of in a safe setting where they're aware of how much cannabis they're obviously consuming, the percentage of THC, CBD, they're also aware of where it's grown. So I think there is definitely a lot of people who can relate to the kind of these similar effects, but once again, your average street dealer isn't selling it as a medicinal product. They're just selling it through supply and demand. It's that simple. They're not selling it as a something to cure your depression or your anxiety, although many people do self-medicate. And although these results are very promising, and I'm very happy that this kind of research is being looked at, I think you've got to also be careful that you don't want to kind of become habit forming out of this. You don't want to be dealing with your symptoms of depression or anxiety or whatever kind of mental health problems you may be having with just using cannabis or anything, even like alcohol down to that level. So I think there is a risk of habit forming, but I also feel as if it was going to be used in a clinical or medical setting, it would be used alongside a psychiatrist to help you tackle those thoughts, but as something to relieve symptoms. And I think we all need our symptoms to be relieved every now and then. It's possible that there could also be some real benefits of using cannabis and mediating a kind of high THC or high low CBD and using them for different effects. And I think it's also positive in this research. It was shown that people were 3 times more likely to experience the positive side effects than the negative ones, such as demoralization and demotivation. So I think it is key that, it's kind of realised that this is kind of like a balance of risk. So the risk here is definitely less than the benefit which could be garnered from the use of cannabis to relieve the symptoms. Continuing, a Royal College of General Practitioners study looked into cannabis use, and they found that cannabis use can exacerbate symptoms of psychosis in individuals who are schizophrenic or have a family history. So I think for a majority of people, they'll be aware if they have schizophrenia or someone in their family would be, although it can obviously be delayed in terms of its diagnosis. However, when it comes to family history, we can't always be sure of our genetic predisposition to the kind of effects of cannabis. And I must also mention that the Royal College of General Practitioners example was from one pulled from the use of recreational cannabis rather than it in a medical setting. But I do think it is important to kind of weigh this against the benefits that I've also spoken about. I have obviously mentioned that I've seen people have some really poor experiences with smoking, and I have seen videos of people who have actually been healthy, otherwise young individuals who have then kind of taken up smoking on an habitual process, and it has been proven that in the long term smoking can actually increase your likelihood of having mental disorders such as schizophrenia. So I think we must obviously have a candid and honest conversation about the perceived benefits and negatives, but for me this is more of a reason that we should look into it and understand it more, and then we can kind of understand the risks to a greater degree and see, well, is it actually worth it, rather than slamming a door and saying, actually, no, we don't even want to look at the kind of potential scientific and medical benefits of having cannabis decriminalised. By far the most comprehensive study I looked at was by Health Europa, and their study looked at the the potential benefits of cannabis for it was anxiety, stress, and depression, which I think are the main three areas which most people can kind of feel a relation to. Especially stress is something I think we kind of all experience on a regular basis. And they found in the case of depression, one inhalation of cannabis, high in CBD but low in THC, found that it relieved people's symptoms in 89.3% of cases. Only in 3.2% of these cases did people have exacerbated symptoms. For anxiety, in the same quantity, so in high CBD and low THC, 95.8% of people felt a reduction of their anxiety. However, it was the cannabis with high THC which helped people with stress reduction, and I can guarantee to you all street cannabis is high in THC. And in times of stress, exam stress, when I smoked, I definitely felt a reduction in stress. But once again, it's probably not the best way to deal with stress in the long term. And just for confirmation as well, this was quite a large study. It contained 12,000 people, and by and large, it was obviously quite beneficial for the kind of the pro cannabis campaign. But once again, it wasn't all through street cannabis. This was obviously cannabis where they'd know where it had been grown, who the growers were, and the potency of it, and how clean it was for people to be smoking. Overall, I believe it's quite clear to see that there's a lot of benefits and negatives of cannabis use, and for me, decriminalisation would definitely make this an easier topic to explore and talk about. I can speak quite openly and candid about this topic just because I feel comfortable with it, but for a lot of people, and a lot of people you may know, it's not easy to talk about their addiction of any drugs, and it's the same for cannabis. It's definitely alienated, and from a young age it's kind of pushed aside and seen as something you shouldn't go near. And for that reason, I feel a lot of people experiment with it and they kind of have to learn the lessons as they go. But I also must say there is definitely a wider availability of different types of cannabis nowadays. For those who are proficient on the dark web, one of my close friends, he's recently got a really good job for his third year, so he's got a placement, and he's been using CBD high cannabis, which he's been ordering off the dark web. And for him, he says he has none of the negative side effects that you have in high THC cannabis, but he gets all of the nice relaxing feelings, the de-stressing, and he can wake up without a stone over. And for anyone who smoked, they know exactly what a stone over is. And for those who don't, just imagine waking up with a hangover, but instead you don't have a headache, but you just feel like you can't move out your bed. You're just stuck there, and it probably takes you about an hour to move out of bed, and then another hour to get anywhere near productive. This will definitely be the longest part of the podcast, as I think there's the most information available on cannabis. So for anyone who wants to take a break, definitely a good time to take a break before I go into the next part. Before you go, I would like to read out a statement which has been sent to me by a very close friend of mine who's currently sitting in prison awaiting trial, and I think a lot of his problems, he would definitely admit to you, started with his adolescent use of cannabis, and it slowly spiraled into a lot more things. But before I say any more, I'd like to read his statement out to you. I've been struggling with drugs since I was 16. I feel if drugs were decriminalised, it would have been easier for me to ask for help, because what I was doing would have been viewed differently. Drugs don't discriminate on the colour of your skin, young or old, whether you're a good or bad person. It doesn't matter. Drugs will break you down until you can't breathe without them, till you wake up every day wondering where you'll get your next buzz. Anyone who is listening and has an addiction and feels it's not causing them any harm, I felt the same way, but I promise you, you're wrong. You are inflicting pain on yourself, your loved ones and friends. You might hate yourself and feel like you're all alone and things will never get better. It's not easy, but you can stop. You'll be a much better person. Talk to someone you feel comfortable with and don't suffer in silence. So let me make this clear. These words are from someone currently sitting behind bars, locked in a cell for 23 hours because of lockdown. And I think they've had a time to reevaluate themselves and the decisions they've made in their life. And they've definitely made a lot of wrong ones, and they'd be the first to tell you that. And their issues really did start with cannabis. And by their own admission, drugs didn't help them, and it only made the pain worse. So I think for all people, regardless of the medical advice, and if cannabis can be seen to have a real material effect on people's symptoms and actually help them, it must be done alongside other techniques such as psychiatrists, talking to your family, and just having an open dialogue in general. This isn't a one fixed solution, and it must be balanced against the risks. On to the next area, I'll be talking about psychedelics or hallucinogens, and for simplicity I'm going to limit the discussion to the ones that I actually have experience with. So firstly it would be truffles. The active ingredient in truffles, which is we could say a cousin to mushrooms, is psilocybin. And my other experience is with 2CB, which is, you could say, a derivative of MDMA, and it was created by the biochemist Alexander Shulgin, who's he liked psychedelics a fair bit, this guy, you could say the least. The use of psychedelics dates back to the Egyptians, really, and their use of dimethyltryptamine, or many may know it as DMT. You have North American and Mexican tribes who used the ancient peyote, the peyote plant. It's more of a cactus, really. I got that a bit wrong. But it's called the grandfather plant because I believe it takes about 30 years to grow. So it's not something which is quite readily available to everyone. And it's supposed to give you an ego death and the experience of a lifetime, essentially. Hence, it's called the grandfather plant. And some of the use of these hallucinogens or psychedelics dates back nearly 3,000 years ago. You also have the use of ayahuasca, which is commonly found in teas brewed by Amazonian shaman. And a lot of these have very kind of similar effects. They kind of give you an ego death. You kind of see some kind of mystic, you could say, god under the influence. And I do actually have friends who have used acid and other kind of psychedelics who've experienced seeing gods. And trust me, these are my less religious friends. I think the thing that's sad about hallucinogens, psychedelics in general, is that many of them obviously originate in countries such as Mexico or the Amazon basin, so kind of which covers kind of a lot of South America and the Middle East, and these are also areas which were colonized, and a lot of the use of these psychedelics was used by ancient tribes, and they kind of have a very long history. And when colonialists, especially kind of the Portuguese, the Spanish, and us, the British, kind of went overseas, and when we saw the use of these kind of psychedelics, they were kind of associated with some like demonic rituals, and they kind of, from this point on, they kind of become taboo subjects, and they kind of got pushed to the underworld, and they've not really been used to a large extent ever since, and it's kind of been forgotten, and which for me is quite sad, because I feel that anything should kind of be explored and understood and looked into on a scientific and a kind of subjective level. And I feel that if you're leaving a stone unturned, you're neglecting knowledge in its most pure sense. I obviously won't be able to look into all of the areas that I've just mentioned, such as peyote and ayahuasca, but I would advise people to look into them themselves. Ayahuasca is a very fascinating drug which has been used, and in some cases there's been studies where people with really bad opiate addictions, especially in the USA, and it's definitely a problem we're seeing take hold in the UK, they've gone to these ayahuasca retreats, and within a day they no longer touch opioids. And for anyone who's dealt with someone with an opioid addiction or works in a medical profession, it's not something easy to deal with, and it takes a long time, maybe sometimes years, to kind of get over this addiction and really find solace in oneself. So for anyone kind of interested or has any kind of background in it, I'd say definitely look into it. My first experience with psychedelics was with truffles in Amsterdam, and I just turned 18 at this point, and without going into too much detail at first, it was probably one of the most eye-opening experiences I think I've ever experienced in my life. There's no doubt it's something I hold very close to me to this day, and I was a very unenlightened weed addict at this point. And I just remember the experience. I was coming up, me and my friend were just going to the train station to go into City Central, and I've never looked at so many people from a perspective of being unified with them. I kind of felt a sense of encapsulating energy around us all, and each person I looked at, despite the language barrier, I kind of understood where they come from. I understood that each person had a story to tell. They had their own life struggles, and I looked at nature in such a different way that my perspective on life was completely altered from that point. And that's not an over exaggeration, that's not me trying to be a mystic at all. I genuinely mean it. It kind of changed the way I looked at the world, and for me it was definitely a part of like my progression and understanding of life in general, really. I felt as if everything just fit together for like one of the first times in my life. I felt the puzzle pieces of life had all fit together nice and neatly, and everything just kind of made sense to me. And I've never felt that kind of pure euphoria. There's euphoria you can get from other drugs, but I honestly don't think there's anything that can kind of match that experience for me. And I think from that point on, I definitely led my life in a different way. And I think the most notable way that I saw myself change was just the way I conducted myself with other people. Because for anyone that knows me knows I was definitely an arrogant bastard who was intolerant of other people. But from that point on, I just kind of took every situation differently and kind of gave people patience, I think, is really what it comes down to. I would love to be kind of fair and say, well, there was this negative and so forth, but from my personal experiences, I really can't say I had a bad time using truffles. I had a second experience of using them with my girlfriend at the time, and I chose much more powerful ones. And instead of going into the city, I felt it was probably smart that both of us kind of stayed into our hotel room together. I've already experienced them, but I was obviously using stronger ones, and this was obviously her first experience of anything psychedelic. So I thought, right, let's keep it like a safe environment so nothing can go wrong. And that's probably a really smart decision, because I had some of the most vibrant visual effects ever. I mean, talk about Hollywood side effects. They come nowhere near the kind of side effects you get from psilocybin. I mean, I was seeing all sorts of patterns and designs and colours all over the wall. My eyes were just buzzing all over the place, and after about 2 hours, honestly, it just got too intense. And I remember grabbing for the orange juice, because anything high in sugar kind of dulls down the high. And obviously my girlfriend at the time is on a completely different plane of existence to me, and she's attacking me whilst I'm trying to obviously make my experience easier and saying, no, you can't do this, you can't leave me to be on this kind of experience on my own. And in all honesty, it was fine, nothing really went wrong. I was able to have my orange juice in the end, and I was able to kind of dull the effects. But I think you can definitely see that if we was outside and I started kind of panicking, and then she kind of started panicking because I am, it could have obviously gone really bad. So I'd definitely say for psychedelics, treat them with a lot of respect, and make sure you're with the right person or people, and that you know what you're doing. Definitely don't just kind of do it on a whim. Overall, I must say my first experience was probably more eye-opening, and I think that's a lot of people can kind of relate to that type of feeling when it's their first experience of any drug, but especially with psychedelics, it's just like some kind of feeling just comes over you, which you just can't explain until you try it, in honesty, and anyone who's tried would understand me. But my second time was a bit different, and I think I always react to psychedelics better on an outside environment, but both experiences in their different ways were amazing, and I enjoyed them, and their experiences I'll never personally forget. But although I had two really good experiences, I do have a story to tell of a very, very close friend of mine of the first time I was in Amsterdam, and we all took the same shrooms, or truffles they were, and we was in two different groups at a time, and one group had gone out, and this one my friend was in, and my friend said to them, oh, don't worry boys, I'll stay in the room, I just need like to get ready or whatever. He just didn't want to really go out at that time. Well, he got left in the room, and we met up with that group of boys. We was all talking, and I was like, where is he? Like, is he all right? And then about half an hour, we get a phone call from our friend in the south of France at the time saying, you need to go back to the hotel room. Our mate is like panicking, he's worrying, he's crying, he's trying to book a flight back home to the UK. Like, he's really having a panic attack in his room. And then when I spoke to him about this experience, his words to me were that he went blind, he couldn't see anything, he was just having like a total meltdown. And as funny as it is now, because obviously he's got through it, he was fine, we obviously went back and looked after him, and yeah, like the rest of the day was sweet, nothing wrong with him. It does show that like under the wrong settings, and if you're not under supervision, things can go wrong, and they can really decline and go very wrong if you're not in the right environment. But this same person, his words to me when I obviously spoke to him about it as well was, he's obviously had more than one experience with them, and it didn't deter him, because he understood that he kind of made the wrong decisions whilst he was under influence. And he said to me that the experience of feeling the wind go past your head, and he's got a bald head, so he can definitely feel the wind go past his head, the sun on your skin, the life in trees, like he just kind of felt connected with nature. So I guess for every bad experience you can talk about the good ones, and he's definitely had some really eye-opening and amazing experiences with psychedelics. And I'd probably forward that and say that when I was out in nature and I was open to explore, you just feel you're unified with the world. And for me, on a political level, I feel that's the way that we should see things. We shouldn't see things in a divisive way. And I think if more people at least tried psychedelics once, and under a safe environment and with people there to kind of mind them, I think you'd kind of come out of it with a new perspective on the world and people. My most recent experience with psychedelics was with 2CB, which isn't a natural one, but it is seen as very safe. And for me, this was a quite an interesting one. So I was really only doing it for recreational use, if I'm honest. It's just a few of us had gone to a city university, and we just staying there, and we thought, right, let's all try it, and all of us have tried it yet, so we'll give it a go. when I started coming up, I felt a bit anxious, didn't really like it, felt a bit enclosed. So me and one of my other friends decided, right, let's just go on a walk around Birmingham, and we're pretty much in the city centre at this point. And so yeah, we just decided to go on a walk literally as we're coming up. So probably at our most vulnerable, but we both experienced stronger trips, and 2CB comes nowhere near psilocybin in it when it comes to its effects. So we're just walking around the city, going through Birmingham's famed canals, which aren't really that glorious, but they look okay when you're high. And then we go past, what's the best way to explain this area? I felt as if I'd entered East London, and for anyone who lives in East London, I know a couple of my friends do, or anyone that's kind of in East London on a common basis, imagine the ethnic makeup of East London. Well, that's kind of where I was in Birmingham, and it was probably one of the most working class areas I've seen in my life. And honestly, the streets were dirty, the council obviously had no presence there. It was working class Birmingham at its worst, really. But whilst I was on 2CB, my experience and my understanding and my comprehension of this area was different. I didn't see it as what you probably would as sober, as a dirty area which you probably didn't want to be in. I just saw everyone with humanity. I saw everything in a different way. And I remember us walking past this one area which just was run down, it was derelict. And me and my friend kind of looked at each other and said, like, how can such a bad area look so good? And I think this really speaks to like the effect of psychedelics. It just kind of opens your frame of reference to things and the way you understand life and structures and existence in general. And it really kind of makes you ask some bigger questions and not be so judgmental on. So for me, on the kind of the three main experiences I've had under like psychedelics, you could say I've not really had a bad one. But once again, for this example of 2CB that I had recently, one of my friends was also under the influence of 2CB, and I've honestly never seen him in such a bad way in my life. And I mean, this is the same kid that got arrested in Zante. He was, he had his head over the toilet for borderline 3 hours, just getting sick constantly. And don't get me wrong, he wasn't just under the influence of 2CB. There was about 3 or 4 other things mixed in with it. But nonetheless, I'd never seen him in that state, and he did afflict it partially to the use of TCB, and obviously it kind of gives you some visuals to an extent, and it definitely didn't help him. And once again, I kind of do think it speaks to the fact that recreational use isn't always safe, and as much as many of us have experienced and tried it and kind of know when it is safe, you can never be sure of what you're consuming, and it's always better to kind of use them in isolation rather than kind of mixing. But we are all guilty of mixing, so I'm not going to act like I'm a superior force that I never mix my drugs, because I definitely have, and I probably will in the future as well. Moving on from the subjective and anecdotal cases, it's always important to look at the actual evidence. Sadly, for psychedelics, there is a very limited science, and a lot of it isn't actually peer reviewed, which is obviously a downfall in the research. And a majority of it was conducted in the 60s and 70s before there was really a clamp down on psychedelics, which is quite upsetting, but there is still a lot of good research to be looked into. The most limited research is definitely for 2CB. For psilocybin, mushrooms or truffles, there is still a fair amount of research, but for 2CB, I honestly looked through scientific journals. I had one of my friends who studies pharmacy try and find me research on it, and honestly, it was all fruitless. But on the small amount of research there was acknowledgement of the enthenogenic, and I am reading that because it's a very hard word to say, enthenogenic, so your ability to understand emotions and feel empathy. This was kind of seen in studies of people who'd used it. Also, my friend, when he did look at the research, did believe that there was definitely some opportunity for it to be able to be used as a way of treating depression and its symptoms. And the way it would work is kind of through opening a window of opportunity. So if I kind of extrapolate that to kind of what I was saying about when I was in Birmingham, it was this kind of ability to look at things through a different lens and kind of understand them differently. And I guess in a way it kind of makes your mind more malleable and accepting of different kind of narratives than the ones you're used to. Moreover, I'd say in general, this kind of drug such as 2CB, it kind of offers a softening of the ego for people, and it kind of gives a new perspective on negative habits and destructive behaviours that we may have. So the literature is limited, and I wouldn't advise anyone who's having any problems or they want some kind of new insight and understanding of where they are in life to go and buy some 2CB off your street dealer. But I think for scientific purposes, there's definitely something which needs to be explored, and in my experiences of it, I had nothing negative, but for others there have been negative consequences. But I'd say 9 out of 10 people that I know who have used 2CB, they've had kind of a very positive experience of it, and it's kind of less intense than the other psychedelics you may get on the street. but it definitely belongs to the streets, so keep it there. The amount of research for psilocybin, so mushrooms, truffles, is definitely a lot more respected, and it's definitely been peer reviewed a lot more than for 2CB. So one of the first studies that I looked at was from King's College London, so definitely a respectable source. They showed in their studies that the use of psilocybin can dissolve old patterns and act as a therapeutic window of opportunity, as a kind of reference to what I said about 2CB. Furthermore, it's kind of like a waking dream with real insights and understanding emerging about why they are suffering. It can be psychologically difficult for people to handle, but it's definitely not dangerous for them in any kind of like physiological sense, which I think is really important. But it also must be noted that in the study by King's College London, this was with laboratory made psilocybin, but nonetheless this is still the active ingredient which is present in mushrooms and truffles. I think one of the main things as well with psychedelics and their ability to be used for as an antidepressant or for anxiety or stress, more so depression is being looked into, is that it doesn't come with the extensive side effects that your normal pharmaceutical treatments do. One of the ones that I'm most aware of is Xanax. So the friend that I referred to earlier, his kind of drug addiction kind of slowly spiraled into his use of Xanax, which for those who are aware is kind of a prescription antidepressant. So obviously he didn't get prescribed it, and his usage was more of a self-medication way or kind of recreational. But the effects that I saw of this pill, and honestly it was just a tiny pill, I've never seen anything like it, and I've seen some states and I've never seen anything like it. And if I'm honest, I tried it once myself. I only tried half of a pill of it, and the person that I became under the influence of this was, I honestly can't describe it other than a monster. Like it kind of exacerbated everything that was negative about myself. And obviously I wasn't depressed at the time, but I can't imagine that anyone who is depressed, how this can possibly help them. It kind of sends you into a very sedated state. You're not aware of yourself as such. You're just kind of sedated to the point where you can't feel anything. You just become numb. And personally, I don't see how this can kind of be beneficial for anyone, especially if you're depressed, because it isn't going to open up this window where you can kind of start to reevaluate bad habits. It's just actually going to kind of sedate you till you feel nothing anymore. And I've had family members very close to me who've suffered from depression, and when they go to the doctors, it was kind of advised them to kind of go on to an antidepressant. And from the friends that they'd known that tried these antidepressants, it was, don't do it. Tackle the problems the way you can, because all they will do is prescribe you and keep going, and kind of you then become hooked on a prescription drug. So what's worse, like for me, I feel there's other opportunities which could kind of be looked into, and I think psilocybin is definitely one of those ones. It's also very important to note that in literally every medical journal that I've looked at when I've been conducting my studies for this podcast, that no one has attributed psychedelics to being addictive as substances in general, and they're also not toxic. So I feel as if there's definitely real viability for these to be used to kind of tackle people's like deep-rooted problems and kind of open them up to explore them in a different way than they would in the sober mind. And from the experiences that I'm aware of and the people that I know, I definitely don't think the pharmaceutical treatments that many of us are exposed to are the right ways to deal with these kind of problems. Putting an eye to the science a little bit, as I know there are people out there who are listening who do like to understand the science of it. The reason why psilocybin is so effective is because it acts upon the default mode network, which is a kind of part of the brain, which when it becomes really stimulated can kind of have negative side effects, one of them being stress or anxiety, and in some cases it can kind of be attributed alongside other factors to depression. And essentially what it does, psychedelics do, is they dampen this part of the brain, and this is kind of part of the reason why people have the different effects, especially the kind of the therapeutic benefits of like opening up opportunities to look at bad habits in a different way and just kind of de-stress in general. When looking into my research, I was able to find a fair few studies of the use of psilocybin, from PTSD to depression to people who were treatment resistant to depression, and as well as smokers as well. So one of the studies, participants all reported the sensation of a touching or a unifying with a higher state of reality. This is definitely something I can relate to, and definitely something I touched on my experiences. Although in this same study, it was reported that higher doses could cause anxiety and higher blood pressure. So there are still some risks, but these are very low, and it was reported that these could be mitigated by other factors. One of the most fascinating studies for me was a small study of 15 people where it was all habitual smokers of tobacco, And over a 15-week period, they were all given psilocybin on a periodic basis. It wasn't many times. I don't think it was more than 5. After 6 months, all but 3 of the group had completely stopped smoking entirely. And I believe one of the adages is it takes a month or so to break a habit or an addiction. So I think measuring that against 6 months is quite remarkable, that all of these habitual smokers after 6 months had completely stopped smoking and had no intention in going back to it. So although this is only a small study, I think it's really indicative of the possibilities that psilocybin has, not just for treatment of depression or anxiety, but for curing addictions as well. And these are harmful addictions which cost countries around the world a lot of money. So I think it's quite upsetting that the viability of psilocybin has been looked into at a greater level so far. I think it's key to note that in all of these examples, it was all done in kind of like a medical environment under supervision of professionals, and they was clear on the dosage and obviously the source of the dosage. One of the main drawbacks was a different study I looked at. There was 18 members and they had no clear guidance. There was no specific setting that they had to use the psilocybin, or I believe it was mushrooms in this example. 39% of the people suffered extreme fear. 44% suffered delusional thoughts and paranoia. However, the only benefit, I guess you could say, was that none of these people felt the side effects after the session. So once again, it kind of speaks to the importance of making sure you're in a safe setting with the right people when you obviously consume this drug, and also to not kind of do it in a very high dosage, because it can be very dangerous if you do take it at a high dosage. Concluding the part about psychedelics shouldn't be touted as some miracle cure to your mental health problems, in hope of some transcendent ability to comprehend the universe. Their effectiveness comes down to the individual. You'll get what you're seeking from them if you're willing to put the foundation and structure in place to supplement your experience to enable you to grow. They are a group of drugs which should be highly respected, and although they are generally safe for recreational usage, and it's likely they could help people with forms of depression or anxiety, they should still be treated with the utmost respect, and by no means should they be abused. At the end of the day, there is no drug which is going to cure people's problems, and I think the key thing is to do these kind of drugs under supervision. In most of the studies that I looked at, the overwhelming advice was these drugs could help to open up people to their past trauma and their negative habits, and thus giving people a new opportunity to tackle their demons in a constructive way. One of the most compelling arguments that I've read about the use of psychedelics was by Aldous Huxley. For anyone who hasn't heard of him, I definitely advise you to read some of his books, especially The Brave New World. And for anyone who's aware of George Orwell and the book 1984, definitely read his Brave New World, which for me is a much more accurate depiction of our dystopian world that we'd be falling into. In George Orwell's sequence of events, it's that we'll kind of be controlled by a nanny state government and a big brother who's aware of everything that we do. And I think the idea that Aldous Huxley presents to us is one which is far more compelling, and I think one which relates to the society we live in currently. And it's the belief that we'll be controlled by the technologies that we love, to the point that we won't care what we're being fed as long as we're happy and got the technology in front of us. And I think for many of us that kind of speaks to our smartphones and how sucked in most of us of all generations are to these devices, and how numb we've become to the differences in society and the kind of echo chamber many of us have been caught up in. Ultimately, it was this sequence of events that Huxley felt that we'd fall into, and it would be the downfall of mankind. And I think many of us can definitely see these kind of events playing out right in front of us now. The reason that I mention Huxley in reference to psychedelics is because he was a vanguard of psychedelics in their early days, and at one point he was open to being the first human experiment of one of the psychedelics that I mentioned earlier, being peyote, in the 1950s. And it was for their ability to facilitate mystical incitement with benefits of science, art and religion that he applauded their ability for. Furthermore, he also saw their ability to achieve a level of consciousness which is usually restricted by the reductive valve which he saw was our brain. Overall, my belief is that psychedelics are something which should definitely be decriminalised, especially in the UK. I don't advocate the self-medication of anyone, but it is quite clear that the risks, when weighed against the benefits, are much lower than you could be perceived for many other drugs. The last drug I'll be looking at in reference to mental health will be MDMA. MDMA was created and synthesised by Anton Hollison in 1912 and has been one of the most highly controlled drugs in theory rather than practice. I think for anyone of my age group, speaking, let's say 16 up to 21, 25, it's probably one of the first and easy, already available drugs out there. So it may be class A, but it's very easy to get hold of. My first experience of MDMA was in 2017, I believe, and this is at V Festival in Chelmsford, for those that are aware. I must say it's probably one of the most euphoric experiences of my life the first time I took it, but the following 2 days of the festival, I've never felt so low in my life. It was as if all my serotonin levels had been just been shot completely. It was like I had zero left in me to go. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to do anything other than just stand still and just wait for this feeling to just subside and go away. I was meant to be getting picked up by my mother on the last day, but it was probably on the best advice by my friends that I stay the extra night under their supervision, and they were all definitely in the correct state of mind to be looking after me and for me to go home the following day when I was at least a little bit happier. But the following week, I pretty much spent in my bed the whole week. Literally, I didn't move. I think I just put in an order every day of tropical juice, and I think it was spicy rice cakes. I think that's pretty much all I had for about a week, just sitting in bed. Oh, and jerk chicken. That's literally my lifeline. And that's pretty much all I'd done for a whole week, just watching Netflix, feeling depressed, having mood swings. Like, honestly, must have been one of the worst experiences of my life. So straight away you can tell the negatives of MDMA are definitely there, and I can understand why it is a controlled substance. However, despite this very negative experience, I have tried it on a handful of occasions, and quite literally just a handful, not too many. And I don't think I've ever kind of got to that euphoric moment I had on my first time. And every time the negatives are just, they definitely outweigh the benefits of it. And it's definitely not something I really enjoy doing, and I haven't really done in a long time. But however, I do have friends who kind of, I wouldn't say microdose it, but definitely do it at a lower gram level. So let's say a quarter of a gram, for example, or even less, a tenth of a gram. And they kind of are able to kind of balance out the negatives, which you kind of feel after, with the immediate benefits of the buzz and the kind of general euphoria you feel. So there's definitely some benefits to it. But I wouldn't say I've ever had any experience anyone using it to kind of help them with depression or anxiety. And if anyone that I do know who's used it when they're in that kind of state of mind, it's definitely not good for them, and it's definitely something I'd advise avoiding. Overall, it's pretty fair to say I'm not the biggest fan of MDMA. However, the therapeutic benefits have been researched, and there definitely is some takeaways to be considered. As nearly an hour of this podcast has been consumed by just looking at the mental health effects of drugs, whether they're positives or negatives, I'm just going to skim over the research based on MDMA. But one of the ones I found quite interesting was the Medical University of South Carolina decided to use MDMA in microdosing treatments for PTSD and depression. Through their research, they was able to show that MDMA was effective in treating PTSD and depression, and it was also approved by the FDA. This opens a door in America for more research to be conducted in this field and to look at more environments where it may be viable to use MDMA for the treatment of other disorders. Another example is Mind Medicine in Australia, which has claimed MDMA may offer the potentially the most significant innovation in mental health we've seen in decades. Arguments have also suggested that psychiatrists could benefit from the use of microdosing patients so they could build a rapport and help people deal with difficult emotions they may not feel open to discuss when they are sober. However, there has been scientific research to show that the use of MDMA can actually kill serotonin receptors in the brain, and I can definitely tell you for a week I honestly couldn't produce any serotonin at all. It's fair to say my first experience was definitely high dosage and consumed in an environment to maximise stimulation, and neither was it done responsibly, but there is no doubt myself and others expose themselves emotionally to others at the greatest limits whilst under the influence. If this feeling could be harnessed under small dosages and in a controlled environment, there are definitely potential benefits, but it's fair to say there is also a lack of recent research to support this. Right, for the rest of the episode, I'm just going to speak about drugs in a general, holistic manner. If I was to continue in the same vein, it would honestly take me another 2 hours to finish. So the next kind of area I'll be looking at is the criminal justice system. For those who listened last time, the level of overpopulation in UK prisons is around 60%. Many of those sentenced to custodial sentences are offenders of drug-related legislation, constituting around 16% of prison sentences. Could this decriminalisation alleviate pressure on the justice system and offer offenders alternative paths to be beneficial to society rather than a burden? There's no escaping the fact that this is a very complex issue, and there's not just one approach which is going to solve it. And by no means is decriminalising drugs going to stop people from offending and going to prison. However, I think Portugal is a brilliant example to look at on how decriminalisation can help society. After the fall of fascist leadership in Portugal in the 1970s, there was a surge of nationals returning from previous colonies such as Mozambique. With them came a flood of opiates, and by the 1990s, 1% of the Portuguese population was addicted to heroin, and Portugal had the highest rate of HIV in Europe. So why did Portugal decide in 2001 to decriminalise drugs? I think this is now a key area to highlight the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. The shift to decriminalisation shifts the policy from one of criminality to one of social and healthcare priority. Rather than labelling drug users, and it is especially targeted at drug users, as criminals, it attempts to redirect these people towards rehabilitation services and understand where their drug usage stems from. It also offers clean paraphernalia to addicts, and especially ones who inject, so they don't get infected with things such as hepatitis B, HIV, and other blood infections. It's key to note that this doesn't make the supply and distribution of drugs legal, and there are still prison terms issued to those people, but it makes the laws much more relaxed for the users of drugs, and instead of putting them into a craft of criminality, it attempts to rehabilitate these people and open up a rapport with social services so they are ready, when they are ready to seek help, they have it available to them. Portugal realised that drug usage and labelling users criminals fail to adequately deal with the problem, and often this labelling creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where addicts turn to crime to support their addiction. Furthermore, Portugal's problem was different to other nations of this time. The epidemic cross-cut all social classes, similar to the opioid crisis currently in the USA and emerging in the UK. By 2001, Portugal officially shifted their approach to a social and healthcare one. It is important to note that this didn't make the supply of drugs legal. Drug dealers and suppliers were still sentenced to custodial sentences, but more often than not, if you was caught with under 10 days worth of supply of drugs, it could be seen as personal usage, and you'd be directed towards social care services rather than the court system. So the question becomes, was this approach successful, and if so, could it be extrapolated to the UK? In 2018, the drug-induced death rate was 5 times lower than the European average in Portugal. The UK, by a comparison, is around joint third in this statistic. Much of this is due to the dedicated teams being formed to help find addicts, provide them with clean paraphernalia, and build a rapport with them so they can offer them the services to help them with their addiction. Part of this strategy is supported by drug consumption facilities. In essence, these are places where addicts can go to practice safely and be free from violence. And in much of the reports in Portugal, they have seen a decrease in public disorder associated with the usage of these rooms. Tackling negative consequences of drug usage is never going to be easy, and it's far from one size fits all. Much of the violence involved in the drug industry comes from competing suppliers in the market, and by affecting the demand, you naturally decrease the amount of suppliers in the market. It's clear that the approach in the UK in recent years has failed to deal with the problems in our society. So for me, it seems clear that there is other options available which have worked for countries which have suffered from drug addiction problems in society. So why not try this method? Lastly, I want to explore the perceived economic benefits of decriminalising drugs in the UK. To further my argument, I'm going to move away from decriminalisation and more towards the spectrum of legalisation. For time's sake, I'm going to focus on a close relative of cannabis which has also been alienated, hemp. A plant which operates in a sort of legal grey area, yet its benefits are manifold. I could dissect the economic data of the USA and Canada, but I'd just be joining a long list of people to do so. So let's make the conversation a little more abstract and apply the potential of hemp to its potential to revolutionise the housing market and move us towards a greener future. A report cited by the BBC states that in England alone we need to build 3 million social homes in the next 2 decades. So the next question really is, do we even have enough space and availability to build this amount of homes? 2.5 million of these homes could be built around 116,000 acres of land available around the UK's 5 largest cities. Of this 3 million figure required, Shelter claims 1.3 million homes are needed to help those in the greatest need. To reach 3 million homes, it is estimated by Capital Economics this would cost 10.7 billion a year. However, Shelter believes over 30 years it would save the government 60 billion overall. In terms of saving, this refers to the amount of money that would be saved by the health services and social services for people who are most vulnerable, using these services less as they'd have stability in their households. So I'm throwing a lot of numbers around currently, so I apologise, I'm not trying to be a textbook. The last figure, the average home price in the UK is £230,000 per year. The average earnings is just £30,000. I'll let you do the maths on how long it would take to save for a house. So we have a lack of affordable homes in general, so how could hemp be the solution to this? So here's my proposition. Hemp 3D printed houses with the assistance of intuitive AI. Sounds far-fetched, but people say that about all the greatest ideas. This podcast has already gone on long enough, so I won't bore everyone with the research and justification for 3D printing and intuitive AI, but if there are any willing investors listening, do drop a comment. So the question becomes, why could hemp provide the much needed alternative to conventional building materials? So let's put this into context of climate change. We need to build an extortionate amount of homes by virtue of one of the most carbon intensive industries. So we have a bit of a conundrum going on here. Concrete manufacturing plants alone contribute to 5% of the globe's CO2 emissions, and buildings in general are estimated to account for 50% of the world's carbon emissions when embodied emissions are taken into account. So for those who aren't aware of what embodied emissions, this refers to the process of getting building materials to site, the putting of the materials together, the operation of the building, the lifetime of the building. So we clearly have a problem here where we have inefficient buildings for a world where we need to be as efficient as possible to avoid the cataclysmic events which climate change could cause. So despite world leaders all claiming that they are doing their part to curb global warming and cut their emissions, other than Donald Trump, it is clear that we still have some large issues to tackle. Oh, and slight disclaimer, anyone who's a climate change denier, it's probably a good time to tune out. We are near the end anyway, and I'll be sure to convert you to a climate change believer by the time I finish review. Anyway, back to topic. Current predictions by CIE MAP state that by 2050, embodied carbon is set to account for 40% of annual emissions from the built environment. The same research body targets the construction industry in the UK as the biggest area to cut emissions for the future. Hemp is the missing piece of the puzzle. Hemp can be grown in all climates and requires very little input, and importantly, doesn't require pesticides which can contaminate crops and water sources, which are becoming increasingly scarce. It can yield 3 to 8 dry tons of fibre per acre. Furthermore, 6 full harvests can be gained per year. No wonder in the 1700s it was legally mandated in the USA for all to grow hemp due to its versatility and resistance. When mixed with lime water, hempcrete is created, and this is where the real magic occurs. For construction purposes, hemp is 1/9 the weight of concrete. Of current, it is not deemed safe as a load-bearing wall, but when there is a will, there is definitely a way, especially when there's a bit of science involved. This also offers a way to build composite homes, and due to its lightness reduces the use of HGVs, which are one of the large polluters on our transport network. Hempcrete is also resistant to mould, naturally highly insulating, which reduces energy demand and overall reduces operating costs. The part which is most fascinating is the fact hempcrete is carbon negative through the growth phase, but also absorbs CO2 in its lifetime, which also increases its structural integrity. Is it time that we take seriously the viability of hemp as a resource to help carve our future? A new, greener one. Literally, greener. Alright, firstly, before I conclude this all, thank you for anyone that's listened to the whole way through. I know it's been a long one, and honestly, it's taken me about 6 hours to record this with little breaks in between. So it's been harder for me than it has been for you, but I can understand it isn't always the most enjoyable thing to listen to my voice. Finishing up, my problem is that the earliest conversation I've had with drugs, be it at school or with parents, has usually been characterised by some scare tactics that make me not even try them and just to kind of accept that they're inherently bad and all they'll do is bad to me. Which to some extent I guess is true, but for many people that I know who never experienced them before going to university, it's definitely become a big factor in their life, and some people I know have definitely formed some problems with drugs through not trying them at a younger age. So for the sake that I tried them younger and I was able to deal with the problems associated with them that they brought to me, I'm happy that it's grown me into a better person. For parents out there that are anti-drugs and have children around my age, and let's say the general age of 16 to 18, it's easy to have an open dialogue and be honest with your children. Otherwise, it's likely they're just going to hide it from you and you'll find out in a bad way. There's a lot of people that I know who are at university who love drugs, and I quite literally mean love them, and they have a good relationship with them as well. They're high achievers and they have a healthy relationship, yet they'd never consider even telling their parents the smallest of the details. However, just because it's a healthy relationship now doesn't mean it'll always be healthy, and there's a likelihood that it could deteriorate into a negative one when they're faced with life challenges. So as a parent, would you prefer for your child to trust you, to be able to tell you their problems and their issues with drugs, or would you prefer them to be scared and deterred from telling you in the face of the consequence which may follow? I think we can all agree that honesty is by far the best policy, and being able to have an open dialogue with people in your family is key to help building a healthy relationship. And yes, that was parental advice from a teenager. Prohibiting, criminalising and marginalising substances, which by and large grow from the soil beneath our feet, is clearly a regression from the direction we should be on. Connecting with nature and understanding its secrets and benefits is key to our growth as a species. Not understanding these substances creates a gap in our knowledge and corrupts our fundamental knowledge of the world. How can you expect to solve the hardest questions when you fail to explore all the potential solutions? The answers aren't always created in artificial labs. As the majority of the podcast is focused on the mental health effects that drugs can have, either positive or negative, I felt it was amped to ask someone that I know who's had a hard time with depression, and at one point they was diagnosed as non-treatment responsive. So this is their words, not mine. Different drugs, whether legal or illegal, can have both positive and negative consequences on mental health issues, each differing on what drug or mental health issue is experienced. First and foremost, there are certain drugs that have subsequently negative effects on certain mental health issues. Cannabis in the form of being smoked can have a detrimental effect on anxiety, causing panic attacks, paranoia, and heightening the side effects one may experience from anxiety. Psychedelics can be detrimental to people experiencing psychotic breaks. Cocaine, for example, can again be detrimental to someone who suffers from depression. On the other hand, the use of holistic treatments such as cannabis oil, or more widely known as CBD oil, can greatly improve and ease a person's suffering. CBD oil has been scientifically proven to have a positive effect on anxiety, depression, insomnia, Parkinson's, just to name a few. Most people experiencing mental health issues' first port of call is usually conventional medication given by a psychiatrist or, more commonly, a doctor. The view is that because these drugs are given to us by health professionals, they are safer, although controversially, this isn't always the case. With certain mental illnesses such as psychosis or bipolar, conventional drugs are a must for that person to maintain a stable mind frame. But for illnesses such as anxiety and depression, there are plenty of holistic treatments which work just as effectively as prescription drugs. Prescription drugs can, although not always, have a detrimental effect on long-term health and can be extremely addictive, which is something that people are scarcely informed of before being prescribed medication. Hypothetically, imagine putting a plaster on a seeping wound. It will cover it from sight and maybe from mind, but when you remove the plaster, the wound will still be there. This is a good analogy for what conventional drugs do to mental health. It is of my opinion that holistic treatments such as mindfulness, meditation, talking therapies, and even the prescription of a correct and controlled substance such as CBD oil, used purely for medical purposes, can be beneficial. It may not be a quick fix, like prescription drugs can be, but they are far less harmful for oneself and also equips you with the right coping mechanisms for the long term to help combat anxious feelings and thoughts. CBD oil is not addictive and does not require a withdrawal period, which more often than not is required with the majority of prescription medication. The medical industry is unfortunately built on the foundation of drugs, therefore medical professionals rarely learn about the positive effects of holistic treatments. I've had a long run suffering with mental health illnesses, in particular anxiety, where I feel as if medical professionals have failed in helping me. At a young age, instead of being referred to properly trained talking therapists or learning healthy coping mechanisms, I was given medication. Years on, I am addicted to multiple prescription medications which just about keep me stable and able to function. I can't help but wonder whether I was educated on what was happening in my mind and taught productive holistic treatments such as meditation instead of being ladled with copious amounts of addictive medication, my life now would be much different. I don't think there's much I need to add on to the end of that. I think the way it's been presented and articulated is important, and it should be taken into consideration when we're considering whether drugs can make a better society if they're decriminalised, and for me, they would. Personally, my belief is in the long term, the decriminalisation and eventual legalisation of drugs would make for a much better society where we're much more open and honest about our problems. I'd like to say thank you for anyone that's listened all the way through. This is nearly half an hour longer than the first episode. I hope the sound quality is much more bearable, and next time, and hopefully next week, I'll have a guest on the show so you don't have to listen to my rambling for an hour and a half. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next week. Not literally see you, but you get what I mean. And remember, share, subscribe, comment, like. It's going to go somewhere, so be one of the first people on the bandwagon.